Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh.
So on the show today, Carol Horton. So Carol is someone I very much admire in the world of yoga, a long-time yoga teacher. She's an academic. She has several books out on yoga. She's deeply involved with yoga service work, so some of the more unusual aspects of yoga, and with a deep thinker in the yoga world. So Carol, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Mark. I'm really happy to be here.
It's nice to see you again. We were just working together in an online course on Facebook, so it's good to have a chance to chat to you one-to-one.
Yeah, that was just last week. So this has really been my embodied yoga, month here. It's great.
So I always start with the same question. How did you get interested in working with the body?
I was beginning junior college professor. I was teaching political science at McAllister College in Minnesota in the US, and I had a regular practice of running and going to the gym. And I was very much in the brain taxi mentality that you mentioned at the beginning of your podcast. I was all about being an academic, being an intellectual, cultivating the mind, but, I wanted to be healthy. I wanted to feel good. So I took care of my body by exercising. And I thought at some point it would be a good idea to add in some stretching. So I started yoga. That was it. Very, very, very pedestrian.
Brain taxi things from my colleague, Francis Bryce. But the first time I ever heard someone fully sign up to that was an academic friend. My friend Gavin, who I grew up with, is an academic now. And he's literally said to me, my body just carries me from one lecture to another. That was literally what he said to me. And
yeah. It's a phrase that resonated with me because I know that culture. I used to be part of it.
I just didn't know what to say. I was like, okay, Gavin. So let's talk a little bit about your yoga background before we look at kind of the ways things you've written about that. You have background in different styles, right? But including forest yoga?
I'm trained and certified as a forest yoga teacher. But I've also, since then, that was about 10 years ago that I did my teacher training, I've moved into the world of what's called trauma-informed yoga. And so I've had two much shorter trainings in that, but also done a lot of writing in that area.
Yeah. So my sense is, your books are on the required reading list for embodied yoga principles teachers. There's a way in which you've sort of thought very deeply about yoga as well as being a practitioner. And sometimes there's sort of people writing about yoga and there's people practicing, and you're one of those people that's sort of deeply in both, is the impression I've got. For those that don't know forest yoga, just because the first time I heard about that, I thought it was some sort of hippie thing in the woods,
Yeah, right. People do tend to think that.
A little bit about that approach, and then we'll look at some of the trauma-sensitive stuff as well.
Forest yoga has nothing to do with practicing out in the woods. It's a method designed by Anna Forrest. So a teacher who's still around now, is part of that 60s generation of American teachers who really started back in the 70s, and kept going. So forest yoga is distinctive as a method because, physically it's very intense, a lot of strength building, long pose holds, that sort of thing. But beyond that, it's really got a heavy orientation towards emotional and psychological healing. So it's a method that really took my yoga practice to a deeper level because it taught me how to direct my attention inward while I was practicing, how to work with my breath in really powerful ways. And the practice involved a combination of intensity, which worked well for me as a personality and my body, but also a sort of slow, deliberate pacing often. So there was really time for me to learn how to shift my attention inward and track what was happening on the level of feeling and sensation while I was practicing. So it's quite distinct in that way.
And say more about yoga or other embodied practices as a methodology for healing. That might not be immediately obvious to people that these things can be healing modalities.
Of course, most people do tend to think of yoga just as exercise and stretching, which is actually exactly how I thought when I started. But when taught and practiced in ways where you're really working with regulating your breath and tracking your attention and sending your mental attention deliberately internally, then it's a powerful entry into the psyche.
Yeah, I remember you talking about some of those key skills on the session you just did in the Facebook event we did. Can you lay out some of those skills that you now see as being in yoga? You were talking about, I remember, attention, specific and wide, intention. Some of those skills, I thought that was really good. And I know a lot of people that did the course really like that. So I'd love to offer that out to our podcast listeners.
What I talked about in the course was I thought that in terms of this internal healing work, the key skill set that I got out of yoga practice was learning how to operate at this leveled consciousness. So having a meditative awareness that's very calm and doesn't use words or concepts. It's just this presence. Then having the ability to tap into the level of feeling and sensation. So emotions, but also just more feeling in the body that you wouldn't necessarily characterize as emotion. And then also the thinking, rational, analytic brain. So those three different levels. And concretely, how I think I was able to develop those skills was in yoga, working with a method that was really deliberate with syncing the mind, movement, and breath. So some yoga classes, there's very little attention to the breath work. Others, like forest yoga, throughout the whole thing, you're starting out, bringing your attention to the breath. You're working with it being very regulated throughout. You're working with different pranayamas. The movement sequence is always synced to your breath. So even when you're doing something very intense, you're breathing in a way that keeps you very calm. And then the mental work is also cultivated. And in the course, I broke it down into attention and intention. So in a lot of classes in yoga, you will set an intent. And while this can seem sort of flaky and woo-woo, it's really a powerful thing to cultivate, to distill out an intent for a practice and to work with it repeatedly, because you're harnessing more of these, all these different layers of your consciousness to cultivating a certain energy or working with a certain sort of goal for your own healing. So intention, quite powerful. And then attention, I think, is where you get into learning basic skills of focusing your attention on something very specific, like your breath, or focusing your eyes on a point. You do that a lot in balancing poses or certain methods like Ashtanga yoga. So learning how to focus on one thing really quiets the mind and helps connect you to that non-narrative awareness. But then also there's a different sort of attention, which is open focus attention, where you hold your field of awareness open, but you're noticing the thoughts and feelings that arise and practicing not getting bound up and carried away with them. So I notice that I'm thinking about, I'm upset with my partner about X, and it comes in, but rather than going off into a whole story about it, I just watch it and then it'll recede and something else will come up and a feeling will come up and it'll come and go. So those tools are really powerful when you can work with them together, because you can imagine if certain challenging feelings come up in a yoga practice, which is often the case as people get deeper into it, being able to be aware of them without reacting to them, working with the body to let go of some of the tension around that, and at the same time feeling calm, it is a very healing process. And that's exactly, some of that sort of work has sort of been conceptualized in a different format than forest yoga and a different set of methods with the trauma-informed yoga.
Yeah, it feels like let me lay those out just kind of in my own language. I think it would be useful for people. So, I mean, you're talking about kind of first three foundations of mindfulness in kind of Buddhist language, like there's body, then there's feeling, tone, emotion, and then there's also thoughts, and learning to be aware of all of those. I think it is worth separating out the first two, even though in English we often say feeling as kind of one thing, it's the sensation and kind of the emotional valence of that. And then working, I heard you essentially talking about self-regulation skills, learning to be relaxed under pressure, which I think is one of the main things people can get from yoga. And just two massively important skills in life, right? Like to focus, like I'm interviewing you, I want to focus on you. I want to focus on what you're saying. If I'm working, I want to focus on that. And then the wider focus of just being able to let it all come and go. I was in a situation where someone had a really annoying voice recently, though what they were saying I wanted to listen to. And I was able just to kind of be like, oh, look, there's irritation. and not be caught in that and let that ruin the experience for me, and just go, okay, well, they're still saying something I want to listen to. Oh, look, there's curiosity as well. And just kind of be kind of that equanimous kind of with that, and just be like, okay, there's irritation arising and that's okay. I'm not that. It's something within the field of my awareness. And the last thing I heard you talk about there was intention. And I really like that. Just as I say, it can sound like hippy dippy, but just in life, like just to give an example from my own life, like I recently was doing this photo shoot in Paris with some friends. We're going around Paris. I was just telling you about this. And I said, let's make this easeful. Let's have the intention that it's going to be fun and easeful. And I'm not going to like push you all day, because I know I can get super pushy about work things. And at some point in the day, it started to feel like hard work. And I just went, hang on a minute. What was our intention here? Let's just go back to, we're just friends having fun in Paris, And
right.
that intentionality. So there's some sense of like, okay, what's my kind of desired way of being during this? Is that kind of another fair summary of what you've said and some of the...
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's really helpful to rephrase these concepts and using different language and connect them to different traditions, because one, it's just interesting to me, but two, it makes it more accessible to different people, because if, the language of yoga doesn't resonate for you, then maybe the language of psychology does, or you're coming from a Buddhist background or whatever. There's different ways in to the same set of experience. It's just a matter of recognizing that and being open to that sort of translation process.
Yeah, I agree. Like, you can talk about equanimity, you can talk about getting your shit together, right?
Right,
and
exactly, yeah.
I think it's skillful as a teacher to be able to go, okay, now I'm in business and I need this language, or now I'm with kids and I need this language. Now I'm with traumatized soldiers, I need this language. Do you know what I mean? Now I'm with new age hippies at a Buddhist festival, I need this language. Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like that's part of the skill of a teacher, is not being attached. And if we get the concepts deep enough, that's actually quite easy.
It may or may not be, because other people may or may not be very attached to their language. And so it all kind of depends. But I'm always looking for, as a writer and as a teacher, just sort of, how can I effectively communicate? So trying to think into how different things will land with different people. And it is sometimes hard to anticipate, but, we do our best.
Let's talk about your writing then, because you are very much a writer as well. You're a yoga teacher, but I see you even more as a writer in some ways, right? So it's like, you wrote your first book was at Yoga PhD, and you've written a couple since. Tell us about the books you've written and why you wrote each one.
Well, so the first book-length project I did had nothing to do with yoga. It was an academic book called Race in the Making of American Liberalism, which, oddly enough, actually in many ways does translate directly into my yoga work, because it was a big kind of macro-historical study about, the development of American politics and culture and identity. And oddly enough, it does in many ways inform how I think about yoga, that work did, because I look at yoga in the world today through a kind of macro historical lens. I'm very interested in, what is modern yoga? How is it different from pre-modern yoga? How did it get here and develop? How are we working with it? How is it changing now? So I bring in a real social science-y sort of lens to...
Is that sorry to jump in, is that your actual academic area, sort of social sciences around ethnicity, around liberalism? Like, is that your sort of main specialism?
Yeah, my degree is in political science, and within that I was focusing on, you could say, American political culture.
Your first book on yoga, say a little bit about that.
Yeah. Okay, so I did 2 books on yoga that came out, I guess in 2012, kind of as a pair, right? So one was one that I just wrote called Yoga PhD, Integrating the Life of the Mind and the Wisdom of the Body. And basically this was me coming from an academic background with a social science training, having started yoga as someone who was just interested in adding some stretching into her workout routine, no affinity with the mind, body, spirit, language or movement or, intentionalities or anything like that. And much to my surprise, finding myself over a course of, some years, experiencing things through yoga that really changed how I thought about everything, basically. Consciousness, myself, the world, spiritual life, and so on. And so I got very interested in like, what is this thing? Why is this happening? How can it be both so profound and yet in so many ways so obviously superficial in terms of what was happening with a lot of the culture around yoga and so on. So I was very interested in kind of how do we put into words this phenomenon that me and so many other people have been caught up in the last several decades in particular, which is this weird hybrid of both like popular, highly commercialized practice that you can do just for exercise in the gym, or that's used to sell vodka, or, you know, expensive pants and all this kind of stuff. Yet at the same time, it can be a kind of a doorway into, you know, really all the stuff that is said that I didn't take seriously, like a transformative mind, body, spirit practice. It's like, oh, wait, that's actually true. How can both those things be true at once? That's so weird. So, so I really wrote the book to kind of capture that interesting complexity from the perspective of just like kind of a regular person who started yoga for stretching. How do I make sense of all that? Right?
Yeah. In many ways, I feel like your story I relate to is also a microcosm of the world, right? Like coming from the prominence of the intellectual, the kind of hyper-intellectual, professional intellectual. And that's kind of, you know, really what we do still value in society. Like if you want to say something's great, you say, oh, this academic said so, there's a study on it. I know there's an anti-intellectual trend too, particularly in the States, but there's still a way in which we place that up high. In France, where I am today, you know, even more so. And then getting to the limits of that and then going, oh, wow, there's this whole other way of knowing. And then starting to experience going, wow, shit, I'm learning stuff that I didn't expect. And that, you know, it's changing my views and I didn't expect that. And even coming to it kind of, you know, body practice just as exercise, or martial arts just for fighting, or dance just as a way of having fun, and realizing like, oh my God, this is other thing there. And then this totally weird situation we find ourselves in of the kind of paradox of, on the one hand, it's, you know, you used to sell expensive leggings or whatever, and it's super commercialized, blah, blah, blah. But on the other hand, it's still like a genuine gateway for so many people. Yeah,
exactly. And I think it's a lot to navigate. Honestly, I think it's, you know, it introduces a lot of confusion for people. And certainly, you know, I experienced a lot of this firsthand. Like just to give one concrete example, a lot of yoga teachers feel that they have to fit a certain sort of manufactured image of a yoga teacher, or they feel inadequate. So I have to be this beautiful, or this thin, or this flexible, or this whatever, or maybe, you know, this serene and this never getting angry about anything, no matter what. You know, there's certain sorts of
a lot of repressed anger.
Yeah, certain sort of images that just culturally sort of accreted around the image of a yoga teacher, and then people aren't really trained like I was to think, oh, I'm very influenced by my culture, and therefore it's hard to often even be aware of how influenced we are by our culture. And in the United States, there's also a lot of resistance to that idea, even because
you guys don't like culture. It seems I've had Americans call me racist when I start talking about culture. And also like I'm going to be in 5 countries this week in Europe. I'm in France, Luxembourg, Belgium, England, and Belgium, 2 parts of Belgium, including Flemish and French speaking part. So like that's a busy week, but that's like, they're pretty different culturally. And that's just one little side of Europe. You know what I mean? Right. It's like different languages, different food practices, different ways of learning when I have students. And it's real obvious in Europe that there's such a thing as culture. Whereas in the States, it seems like there's more like this melting pot philosophy, this hyper individualistic philosophy. And it sometimes seems harder for people to see culture as a thing, particularly if they haven't traveled a lot, you know?
Yeah, so it can get confusing to navigate the internal practice, the culture around it, and just ordinary life. And so I'm really fascinated by just how do we work with the best of what we have available to us today. I focus on the world of yoga, but I'm interested now in all of these, you know, integrative mind body, for lack of a better term, you know, modalities, because I think they do have so much to offer us. and they're so important and useful. But how do we navigate that in this world of, the spiritual marketplace is a famous term, the, commodification of the body, all this kind of stuff. I think it's a lot to make sense out of. And certainly in the yoga world, until recently, there just weren't a lot of people even trying in a very public way, at least, to help people make sense of it. So that was one book, kind of trying to make sense of it for myself and communicate that to other people and give them a more digestible also story about the development of modern yoga. And then at the same time, I released a collection of essays that I solicited and edited in conjunction with another woman, Roseanne Harvey, called 21st Century Yoga, Culture, Politics, and Practice. So that has a dozen different essays, but they're all kind of tying into this overarching project of trying to make sense of what's happening with yoga in a way that's, both personally meaningful, but also more socially progressive and reflective and aware than had been going on, by and large in most of yoga culture at the time.
Yeah, it was interesting that I got hold of that copy of the collection, I think, first a few years ago. And it was such a relief. It was like, because I'd been feeling very frustrated with yoga. And as someone who was fairly political, I'd been fairly frustrated with the sort of political blindness of yoga, what I saw as a kind of trends towards essentially sort of almost like a fascist way of practicing, and using that term very loosely. And then I came across your book, and it was like, wow, yeah, this is fantastic. There are people who are thinking about this, speaking about this. This is on people's radars now. And since that time, which I think was about 4 years ago, I first read the book, it's really exploded. Like the yoga scene has got super aware of political things, almost to the point where I'm going the other way now. I'm going, okay,
right.
We just fucking do it down with dog, like it's got super, and also it's gone from being, I think, fairly conservative at heart to like a very strong trend of sort of social justice. And I know you're involved in this, and we agree on some points and friendly disagree on others. But it seems to be this strong kind of very left-wing social justice trend in yoga now, which didn't exist a while back. Like when I was more left politically, I would be like wanting that, and it didn't exist at all. It seemed like yoga was at heart very conservative. Do what your teacher's told. It's tradition, it's form. Look back, don't question. And that used to drive me nuts. And now the other side also drives me nuts. Like there's this kind of like hardcore social justice kind of trend in yoga. So where do we find ourselves in 2018 with yoga politically?
The more hardcore left politics stuff, I think you'll really see that online in particular, because that's where a lot of people find each other and have those discussions than say like in a local yoga community where people are still by and large just, going to their classes and aren't that heavily involved beyond that on any dimension. But yeah, there's been a huge shift. And I know like when I did the 21st Century Yoga book, almost every single person who contributed to that volume at the time said to me, I thought I was the only one who ever thought about this stuff. And now no one would say that, right? Because it's totally changed. So I did a blog post a couple of years ago about this whole, paradigm shift happening in yoga culture using this Thomas Kuhn structure of scientific revolutions paradigm shift idea. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but yeah. So I think that, what's happening in the yoga world has very much fit that. There was this taken for granted about, the tradition and so on and so forth, as you referred to. We just need to preserve it. Although, in fact, it's become more well known that tradition was really only sort of enshrined as such in like the early to mid 20th century, culturally in that form. Not that yoga doesn't have a longer history and so on and so forth.
Made up fairly recently, Carol. That's the irony when someone says EYP isn't traditional yoga, and I'm like, well, you think your fucking downwards dog is? Like there's when you actually look at the academic studies of the history of yoga, it's pretty modern, most of the kind of standing forms and the kind of modern postural way of practicing, right? That would be pretty foreign to anyone that would call themselves a yogi from 300 years ago plus, right?
I mean, there were definitely asanas that people were doing beyond, sitting meditation, going back certainly to, 12th century or whatever. There was, development of hatha yoga, but something like what we think of as a kind of standard yoga practice of 90 minutes of doing these, poses that link from one to another. I mean, that whole format, is quite new. But I'd say even more radical are the ideas associated with it. I mean, there's been a shift to a very taken for granted modern conception of the purpose of this is to help me on a deep level here and now in my life. You know what I mean? Like this worldly affirming. There may be still people who practice for the purpose of liberating themselves from the cycle of, birth, death, and rebirth. But by and large, I mean, that is not even something that most people, certainly in the West at least, even.
Yeah, most people want to be a bit more relaxed, because they're stressed, or they want to be a bit fitter.
Yeah.
Asked to find a husband, or they want to there's a few reasons people generally go, but I can't imagine many of them being very aligned with a kind of yogi living in a cave somewhere in the Himalayas from a few hundred years ago.
Right. I mean, it's just the underlying sort of worldview that informs the practice. Even when you go beyond, I just want to be a little less stressed. I mean, it tends to be quite different. And so let's see, I lost my train of thought. So we were talking about the paradigm shift and where it's going and the politics. And was there a specific question in there I was supposed to answer?
Okay, I love your thinking generally, so I'm quite happy to give you free rambling range here. So if you're more comfortable with specifics, I'd say something like, what is the current political environment yoga finds itself in 2018?
I think that it's a period where there's a lot of sense of, for the people who are more seriously into it, I'm talking about, not the people who just, they go to a class once in a while, it's just exercise, but getting the people who are more deep into it. I'd say it continues to be a period in which there is, by and large, a lot of confusion, sort of an identity crisis, you could say, because the lineages, yoga's, until recently, very strongly lineage-based in terms of the more serious practitioners and their identities. They've all been breaking down. I mean, right now, as we're talking, there's a big, intense, painful controversy going on in the Ashtanga yoga world, which I'm not a part of. I mean, I spent a year way back when learning the primary series. For those who don't know it, it's just like a set sequence, pretty intensive for 90 minutes. That you practice and learn. But the Ashtanga yoga world is, it's one of the more quote unquote traditional kind of corners of the yoga world that was built around the practice taught by Patani Joyce, a guru who's now being accused, he's passed, but he's being accused of sexual misconduct, right?
And not just him, right? It's all of them, like physical, sexual, and financial abuse, Bikram, Iyengar, whether it's John Friend and drug stuff, Sarah. Like it's like almost every single major style or lineage of yoga has essentially had abuse issues.
Yeah, and so then in the internet age, none of that gets swept under the rug anymore, kept, in the family, so to speak, as it used to be. So all of these big lineages, the senses of identity that went with them, they've just been breaking down. And that cuts to the heart of what was considered to be, the tradition, and also the source of authenticity, and what made this, really, you could feel a sense of certainty that it's not just like me, this kind of random 21st century person, like learning to do some breathing and work with my psyche. I've got this bedrock of this time-tested tradition that I am being trained into, that I stand on. So I know that this is a serious, legit practice that I can really put my faith in. So, that sense that used to be there for so many people has just been shaken.
Yeah, I feel like there's sweeping away, the taking off kind of rug from underneath you with people. And there's a real war for the soul of yoga, and on the one hand, we have people saying, I can wear my leggings and do my Instagram and it doesn't matter, and blah, blah, blah. And on the other hand, we have people in India, a lot of people don't know about this, getting really nasty and going after people and saying, yoga is Indian. It belongs to us. There's a kind of nationalist pretty racist, nationalist kind of group of people out there who are getting, actively persecuting people online about keeping, there is one true yoga and it is Indian, and, that's the way, or the highway. So there's two complete opposite ends, neither of which appeals to me. And then plus, on top of that, I see there's a way in which the yoga used to be completely socially without conscience. And now, mostly for better and occasionally for worse, it seems like people are realizing, the sort of the failure of trickle-down spirituality. Like it feels like people are realizing there's more out there, and there's some really positive things like the Yoga Service Council, which I'd love to hear you talk about, and perhaps some less positive things. So I almost see like a war for the soul of yoga going on right now.
That's true. I mean, in terms of the stuff going on in India, I would agree that most people, certainly in North America, aren't following that or aware. It's bound up with Hindu nationalism. So it's not so much yoga as Indian, because Muslims, for example, in India have gotten into a lot of conflict with the government over some of the yoga, like yoga being mandated in schools and including some of the more religious identified aspects of the practice. Anyway, but the political stuff has definitely become much more front and center. And I would agree by and large for the good, but there are ways in which it can fall into some of the same problems, or exactly the same problems in the larger world, which is just, overly rigid ideologies or, political positions that are treated more like religious doctrines than they are sort of, considered ethically grounded commitments based on, factual interpretations of the complexities of what's happening in the world.
And it's the ideological side, isn't it, rather than actually looking at the realities. And also these groups don't speak to each other very well, because they assert truth from different modalities. Someone will say this is true because the scripture says it is, or it's always been that way. Someone else will say, yeah, but look at this data. We had Ariana Rabinovich on, and she'd pull out some study of yoga data. And someone else will say, well, there is no truth, and it's all fucking relative, kind of postmodern swamp. And it's just like, so they can't really even talk to each other, because they ascertain truth in three fundamentally different ways.
That's true. I mean, again, not unique to yoga, but, yoga involves in sync with the larger society.
Yeah, and that's the culture wars generally, and gender wars generally is expressed in yoga and all the rest of it, and I think we can both get bored with that. But I think the thing that is maybe unique is the veneering in yoga. So there'll be, like, for example, someone will be selling with their cleavage and saying, basically, come to my thing, look at my tits. But actually, then there'll be a spiritual, inspirational quote next to it. Do you know what I mean? Like the juxtaposition of a kind of sexualized body, beautiful selling with the kind of esoteric Eastern spirituality. Now, that is pretty unique and pretty hilarious.
Yeah, well, I mean, certain clothing companies figured out back in the, early part of the 21st century that this was a great combination. Talk about aspirational marketing. You know what I mean? You can have sort of somebody who has the body that the culture tells women they should aspire to. But you can also make it more than that by all of this kind of spiritual, quote unquote, overlay. So, I mean, it's been a hugely successful marketing strategy. But like what I said before, I mean, I think then, it's confusing for people who are just more into it as like solo teachers or entrepreneurs or practitioners, because it's not always so easy to sort of like sort out
what's
happening with the kind of cultural pressures from what you need to market yourself, from who you really are and what you really value and what is this practice really about and doing for you. I think it's very stressful for a lot of people to navigate that terrain. I mean, some people are sort of just happily cynical about, hey, whatever sells, I do, but the people who are more serious about yoga aren't going to feel good with that kind of approach. So it gets tricky.
It's as you say, it's the trickiness of the interwovenness of these things that I think is maybe unique to yoga. And I see a lot of actual, not just deception, but self-deception. Like, do you honestly think people are coming to this because of the quality of your yoga teaching, or because the quality of your six-pack? There's a sort of a way in which one has to kind of lie to oneself. And it's almost like a get-out clause. It's like, nope, I'm not selling with my ass, I'm selling with spirituality. Like that kind of get-out clause, I think, first started in advertising and then people actually believe the get out clause. So there's like a weird double think in their minds.
But you have to remember too that yoga is different from, say, like mindfulness or sitting meditation, in that we do these advanced asana poses, and that also makes it really confusing, because it's not just the six-pack. It's like, can you do this really impressive gymnastic looking pose? And there's been long an assumption that if you are more advanced physically in terms of what sort of poses you can do, you're more advanced spiritually and you're wiser as a person and that sort of thing. And, that's often not in a crass way communicated, but it is part of the culture. And I understand it because, for example, like I've found in certain yoga poses, pigeon pose is one where I've experienced a lot of emotional release, and other people, it's very common. It's a deep hip opener, right? So you have like one leg bent at a kind of right angle in front of you, and then the other leg's straight back, and then you're down on a mat, and it really opens up the hips. For a lot of people, this, as you kind of get more into that area, a lot of emotion comes up, right? And so then as you become more perhaps flexible physically, you're also perhaps going through a process of working through some emotional baggage you've never known about. So then it makes sense for you to think, oh, if I was totally flexible and open, I'd have worked through all my emotional problems, which is actually not true. But there's a way in which it is a seductive idea. Also, I think if you look at somebody who has just incredible beauty and grace physically and can do all sorts of things that are really impressive, and then it also is a spiritual practice, and you have feelings coming, or you feel so much more peaceful or something. You look at the person who has facilitated that experience, and they have these physical characteristics that you don't have, these abilities. And there's a natural tendency to attribute a lot of the powers, what's happening to you, to the teacher, and then to attribute it to their physical prowess as a teacher. So it gets to be very confusing. Like I said, I keep coming back to that. I'm trying to make it unconfusing for people. So that's like sort of
I'm gonna go with confusing
project.
Okay, so there's this kind of confusing modern yoga with multiple strands of kind of politics, from the pretty conservative to the hard left. And, the trauma sensitive side is one thing that we'll probably get Sarah on as well to speak about this. Holmes de Castro, who was also a teacher. Mm-hmm. I think so I can get her on to chat about it. But, we've had a couple of trauma therapists on, but I think you're our first kind of trauma sensitive trained yoga teacher. So what is the relevance? If someone said to you, okay, I'm a yoga teacher, or maybe someone listening to this is a martial arts teacher, which is even less trauma sensitive than yoga generally, why do I need to know about trauma? As a yoga teacher, or as a dance teacher, a martial arts teacher, whatever, why do I need to know about trauma?
Mm-hmm. So I would say, one, to be responsible to your students.
To not fuck them up more.
Yeah. Two, because it gives you deeper insight into these internal processes, their physiological and psycho-emotional components, and it's super helpful and interesting.
Okay, great. I completely agree. And, one of my main teachers, Paul Linden's a trauma therapist, has been on my radar for quite a few years. And I was quite shocked by what I would see in martial arts and yoga and dance as the kind of norms. I just, without having any particular specialist training even, I'd be like, okay, that just doesn't make sense. If someone's been violated and now you're grabbing their body as if it belongs to you and they don't have any permission over that, which is the average yoga adjustment in most classes I've ever been to, then, they're getting the message like, as this one example for people listening, like, hey, your body's not yours and authority figures have power over it. And that's not a message I want to give my students. And I'm certainly not wanting to be in that situation with a student who has already feels like their body isn't theirs and has been violated and, feels like they have to comply to authority figures. So using that, one example is the yoga adjustment, and that, equally would apply to a dance adjustment or a martial arts adjustment. What other examples are there of the importance of some of this trauma awareness in kind of like practical terms? So touch and adjustments is a big one. What other ones are there in terms of for a yoga teacher or a dance teacher that's listening to this?
I think a big one in yoga, this would not apply so much in dance, would be the use of language and silence, right? So in terms of language, the difference between commanding language and invitational language is really stressed in trauma-informed yoga. I guess this could definitely apply to dance if it was therapeutic, right? There's a big difference between sit down, close your eyes, do X, and inviting people to try something out and giving them options. And without confusing them with, a zillion options, but some basic options. And a message throughout that they are in charge of what they elect to do and what they don't elect to do.
That's the key thing, right? The implicit, or one of the key things, the implicit teaching of their choice. So I think this is what a lot of teachers aren't realizing in body, mind, arts, is there's an implicit and an explicit teaching. So the explicit teaching might be sit down and breathe this way. The implicit teaching is do what you're told and you don't have a choice. Implicit teaching could be, hey, you're responsible for your body. You have choice. You don't want to do anything. You don't have to do it. It's not so much just about the language, because I hear some teachers say, I invite you to sit down.
Yeah.
But you're going to punish them if they don't,
Right.
The key thing is actually that you're educating people in terms of their own choice and really meaning that, right? Like, okay, like I said the other day, if you don't want to do this, here's an alternative. Please close your eyes. If you don't want to close your eyes, that's cool. Don't worry about it. Just look down, giving people a few options. And then when somebody does opt out, positively reinforcing that. Say, oh, that's fantastic. Someone's chosen not to do it. That's all good. Or just ignoring them so you're not giving them too much attention, in a way that might be uncomfortable. But actually, that's the real test of whether your language is invitational, isn't it? It's not what you say. Someone doesn't obey the command.
Right. If there's never anyone who doesn't do the suggested option ever, then clearly the message is not getting across. Right. So a sign of success of the teaching for the teacher and the message the student should be getting, that sometimes people exercising these choices and, not doing option 1, but doing option 2, or, the always default option to whatever it may be, sit and work on your presence and grounding and breath instead of doing this pose. If people are not exercising those options, then clearly the message is not getting through, no matter what you're saying.
Yeah, because I think you can almost assume a degree of conformity to authority based on the education most people had in school, parenting, workplace, right? So it's actually quite difficult to invite people into choice, because most people 10% of people are rebels. They're going to try and do the opposite of what you're saying. In the class, that's easy. But the other 90% are going to be trying to figure out, and I used to work a lot with kids. Kids are great at figuring out what they think you want. So if you say, hey, you could do this, well, you could do the shitty variation if you're kind of, they'll hear that and they'll pick up on that and they'll do the one they think you want. But there's actually a sort of conformity that's going on, just because that's how, and no fault of anyone's, that's just how we're trained, right? We've been punished if we didn't do that.
Right.
Please, the urge to please is there. So that's a major factor, I think, in all of this. Okay, what else? What else makes a yoga trauma sensitive as opposed to trauma insensitive?
Thinking about the configuration of the space. Yeah. So there's a lot of attention paid to how are the mats arranged, who's where, do people have choice, understanding that some people may not feel comfortable having other people in back of them. Some people may not feel comfortable having their back to the door where they can't see who's coming in. Being aware of the teacher's body and space and being predictable about it. So it's very common in yoga class to say, maybe just walk around the room when people are in all sorts of poses, talking, to, be very unpredictable in your movements. So a trauma-informed class, and I think that's fine in certain contexts, but if you really wanted to teach a trauma-informed class, predictability is key. So teachers, they generally, stay at the front of the room, or if I'm going to go demonstrate to the side, now I say, now I'm going to go over to this part of the room now so you can see me, because we're all turning this way. I'm not just wandering around,
I remember the first time I was in a little class with Sarah Holmes, the Castro this approach, and she did that. She said, I'm going to go switch the light on now. And before she walks over, and I was like, wow, that's taking it to a new level. And you know, I've certainly realized that like predictability equals safety to a lot of people with trauma backgrounds. And like when I'm teaching in Russia, for example, which is kind of traumatized culture, I like to say at the beginning of a day, here's the structure of the day. Here's when the lunch break will be. And holding boundaries, like taking the lunch at 1 and not half 1 because I went over, and actually keeping to the boundary of 1 and keeping to the finish time and the start time, like the boundaries. If people have had boundaries broken, they need those clear boundaries, right? And this is what I'm going to do in the class. This is the invitation. This is the flow of the day. You know, at some point later, we might be sharing. So giving people a bit of warning if they want to do that, you know, giving people that kind of, oh, do I want to talk? I didn't realize I'd be talking in this class, you know? And I feel like that predictability is really, really helpful in generating safety and the kind of, you know, the trust, because it's, you know, trauma breaks trust, right? So it's that sense of, okay, I can trust this teacher. They're well boundaried around stuff. And then all the kind of professional ethics things, obviously, as well. That just, I mean, I've had teachers turn around and just say, well, what's wrong with sleeping with your students? I don't get it. I'm just a yoga teacher. And,
right.
and I've literally had to sit down and go, okay, do you know what a power dynamic is? They're like, I have no idea. And, you know, and no, not even this guy's fault. He literally hadn't ever had what a power dynamic was explained to him. Not real consent then, is it? I'm like, no.
Yeah. And I mean, I remember a big controversy around this, probably 5 years ago in the yoga world, where there was a teacher who was saying, I mean, he wasn't receptive to the message when told. His view was, hey, you know, it's all freely consenting adults, and if we want to sleep together or whatever, we will. And a lot of people at that time found that quite compelling. So yeah, these kind of issues of power and, you know, all the things we're talking about, the desire of students to, generally speaking, want to do what the authority figure tells them, and how that you're not then inculcating a sense of empowerment, truly. All this kind of thing. I mean, by and large, these things have not been part of teacher trainings in yoga. So I think a lot of the utility of the trauma-informed discourse, it's bringing in much more psychological and emotional awareness to the practice and to the teaching. And then it's also tying that to, you know, a physiological idea of looking for people. Are people more hyperactive, kind of hyper aroused, having a hard time settling, calming down, or are they more kind of hypoactive? Are they having a hard time just energizing? And is there sort of lethargy and depression? And so a trauma-informed teacher is also managing the energetics of the class by being aware that people who've experienced trauma do tend to polarize around those extremes, and that giving them tools to learn how to come more to a self-regulated baseline where you can stay closer to a kind of calm presence and be neither, you know, sort of hyper-reactive or hyper-checked out is desirable. And that's an example of something that I think we can all apply to everyday life. Right? I mean, it kind of comes back to that same thing we're talking about at the beginning of just noticing our reactivity and learning how to be more present and self-regulated and engaged in all sorts of circumstances and not carried off by, you know, what happens. I mean, I think the language of trauma and triggering and so on it's appropriate, but because for some people, you know, an unwanted touch is truly triggering, and it like immediately brings them back to an abuse situation, and, you know, there's flooding of that past memory and emotion. But I think anyone can relate to the idea that sometimes we get more mad than we should about something that happens, because we all do it all the time, and we're letting a lot of sort of pent up emotion or, you know, stress from work. You know, you had a bad day at work and you come home and like you kick your dog, as the classic example, you know, something like that. Like we can all learn how to kind of notice these things more and use these tools that we're learning to manage ourselves. So not just, the purpose isn't just to be like calm, nice, kind of blah, but to be able to be present with ourselves and others in a way that we feel good about, you know, that we're not just reacting, that we're actually making choices about how to be.
Yeah, choices about how to be. That's a nice definition of embodiment in a way. Choices about awareness and choices of how to be. And there's other things, isn't there? Like, you know, not assuming that the body is a safe place for people, or that silence is pleasurable. Or, you know what I mean? Like, well, there's some of these assumptions that might be there that might be not so smart. And I just point listeners to the episodes we've done previously. There's a couple of episodes on trauma, one by Paul Linden, one by, I forget the name, someone else I interviewed, forgive me. And I've got Josephine coming on she does prison yoga in Sweden. I'm interviewing her next week. So I'm going to pick that theme up about trauma sensitive people. She has to really be careful. I had a good conversation with her in Sweden last time I was there. And she's like, she can't, working in a women's prison, she won't call it child's pose because there's women who have been separated from their children. Maybe there's a risk of the trauma sensitive approach going a little bit almost too far. I feel like it's almost like people are losing the assumption of robustness, but maybe too far that way than where it was previously, too far the other way.
Yeah, no, it can definitely happen. It can also make the teacher almost overly inhibited and second guessing oneself as opposed to being present enough and connected enough with the students that there's a sort of intuitively guided flow to the teaching and what you're doing. Because if you're always worried about like, this isn't the right word or this isn't that, I mean, it's too, you're separating yourself from the experience too much. So
to provoke, jump in if I may, like if I say, there's no tigers in this room, Carol, it's like, what immediately I'm drawn to what? Tigers? What? You're thinking about tigers? It's like if I always get my teachers and students to ask permission for touch, but then it's like, don't need to make too big a deal out of it because it's creepy if you do. Right. Like, I touch you in the body area now, as opposed to just looking at someone, putting your hand down, kind of looking to see if that's cool.
It can take us to a place of fear, as opposed to really the truth that this kind of mind-body work can, in fact, I think, really be super effective in tapping people into their own deeper internal resources. And again, we were talking about before, be deeply healing and empowering. And, I think, to me, to be a yoga teacher who's able to really transmit the practice, you have to kind of really believe that on a visceral level. I mean, it's not just a faith, kind of an abstract thing, but you have to have had the experience yourself and seen with other people, the ability to sort of go in deep and be renewed. And there's a sort of mystery about it, I guess is what I'm saying. And when we get too kind of in our heads about everything and the trauma-informed yoga, it's great because it brings in all the psychology and, emotional power dynamics and considerations and carefulness about language and all this stuff, which is by and large been missing in the yoga world and really needs to be thought about and taught and laid out. But if it separates us from our kind of deepest experience that we've had with yoga and we can become so in our heads and then transmit that to the students, then it becomes counterproductive. Definitely, I think that can happen.
Nice. I mean, ultimately, if we have had a deep healing and nourishing experience with the practice, whatever it is, like or yoga or whatever, that's the main thing to transmit, right? Like to transmit that experience that we've had and the faith to say like, hey, actually this has been really healing for me in my life and it can be for you because we ain't so different, I guess. And here's some guidelines about how to get there if you're up for it. It feels like that's maybe the bigger piece. So that's a beautiful distinction. Thank you. And before we wrap up, I'd love to hear a bit more about your yoga service work. What is like yoga service work for people that are new to that idea?
Right. So I'm on the board of a nonprofit called the Yoga Service Council, which is in the U.S., but try to have as much of an international presence and connection as we have. And basically that is a umbrella organization for individuals and organizations who are really, really passionate about making yoga and mindfulness practices truly accessible to all. And our focus, therefore, has been very much on integrating the practices more with major social institutions such as, the educational sector, schools, the criminal justice work, VA hospitals, that's our Veterans Administration, healthcare system in the US. So our focus has tended to be kind of a integration with the social service and human services and educational world. But in terms of the deeper sort of philosophy, our understanding of yoga service is it's any sort of sharing of yoga that is integrating the processes of the concrete practices we do, like the asana, the breathing, the mindfulness, and so on, with an ongoing practice of self-inquiry and self-reflection and what we call conscious relationship. So that's the part that's more different, is that the conscious relationship, the interpersonal relationships and dynamic are considered of co-equal importance as the internal individualistic work and the actual practices. And so in the conscious relationship is the idea of both trying to be as aware as we can of both the individual personal dynamics of, say, in this case, one's students or anyone one is talking to. So you're a unique human being and so on and so forth with your own particular set of experiences, but also the social landscape and how we are all impacted by our, race, our gender, our culture, our, social location, and really trying to educate ourselves about that and to occupy our individual and social positions mindfully and in a way that is both compassionate and caring towards others, but also on a non-hierarchical level of real empathic connection. So, yoga service is not about, yoga teacher with all these great tools is going to help all the low-income kids or whatever, because we have it and you don't. The idea is more about, this is a chance for me to practice yoga by entering into a relationship with you, and you are in all different sorts of circumstances, and we're going to reach out and really connect.
So I love the emphasis on relationship, conscious relationship, because that's often the piece for me missing in modern postural yoga, unless you're doing a really conscious version of acro or something like that, which, isn't usually the case. Sometimes I have a kind of mixed, I often do have mixed feelings about things like talking about privilege and things like that. So what would that concretely look like? If, let's say, someone out there is a white dance teacher from a well-off family and they want to go into a kind of inner city London school or Paris school or whatever, how would that actually look like? Because it's not like, hey, you should be guilty for being white or rich or whatever it is. What does that actually look like in terms of the awareness in that situation?
Yeah, so just speaking in general terms, I think part of what it looks like is committing to educating yourself about the environment you're entering into. So for example, I taught for 5 years at Cook County Jail. And when I started there, I did not know the difference between a jail and a prison. I didn't know that anything about this institution that's in my own city and actually not that far away. So I felt like, hey, I should know something about it. So I started reading about it. I started learning about it. And it was a real eye-opener. So some of that you just have to want to learn. If you're going into a school system, you need to learn about that school system. You need to know something about education. You need to be open to and interested in learning from the teachers and from the principal and, understanding the curriculum, connecting with it. I mean, the same is true, hospital, healthcare, prison, whatever. So learning about the larger social systems, both organizational and more informal, actually, devoting some time to that and considering that part of your yoga practice to learn about it. And then I think if you're engaged in this self-reflection and self-inquiry, these issues of privilege and so on and so forth, something like that is likely to come up, right? I definitely, it's just natural. If I'm walking into, say, again, Cook County Jail, I'm white, I'm relatively affluent, I'm very highly educated, and I'm going into an environment where most people are people of color, definitely low income, definitely low levels of education. I mean, it would be ridiculous not to reflect on that. And the more I learn about the injustices that are, sort of baked into that institution, the more there is to reflect on. And then having to really kind of process my feelings and come to terms and go in where I'm not connecting with people from a position of guilt or shame or separation, where I'm ready to practice connecting to people on a level of we have radically different circumstances, that's obvious, and I'm going to offer what I have, and I'm going to learn from the opportunity of teaching in this environment. And I think what a lot of people find is that process of sort of grappling with the emotional challenges that being more aware of your own social position can bring is an immensely, rewarding one. And it's one of great personal growth. If you engage in it, and doing that kind of teaching can, just really be such a nice process for everyone involved in different ways. But it must be approached on a level of sort of honesty, I think, and like deep humanity, right? That like we have kind of like I was saying about, like, it's good to know all the trauma-informed stuff and all, and really be mindful. But if you lose sight of sort of the power of your own practice and the fact that what you really want to help people connect to is a really almost mysterious capacity that human beings have to tap into something really deep and powerful and sort of, radically peaceful, for lack of a better phrase, that's healing. It's a process that, it's not like you can't really dissect it and break it down. It's just you've experienced it, you've seen it with others, and are going from that experience, right? So I think it's the same thing, that you coming to a place where we're operating from such a level of deep humanity that I'm enough in touch with my humanity. Like, I understand no matter how different our circumstances are, I can recognize that, I can understand its importance, but also at the same time, on a human level, we share an absolutely fundamental experience, right? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of that like non-dual, awareness and experience. It's like both and.
Yeah, that resonates with me so much more than kind of hyper-intellectual kind of political correctness, if I'm honest, about checking my privilege and things like that. That what you said there really resonates with me. So thank you for that, Carol.
Thanks.
Okay, it's a pleasure as ever. And in terms of finding out more about you, where should people go? New book out, feel free to plug that.
I've got a website, personal website, carolhortonphd.com. All my books are listed there. And the Yoga Service Council also has a lot on our website, which is just yogaservicecouncil.org.
Okay, and any final message about the body for our listeners?
It's really easy to get disillusioned and cynical about how these practices like yoga play out in the commercial sphere, within the community itself, with all the power abuses and dynamics that go on. And we really need to move to a place of practicing non-dual awareness on that stuff as well, so we can embrace both the reality that any sort of tradition is going to have the sort of human problems that show up in all other spheres of life, but that doesn't negate the fact that there's something incredibly valuable, important and healing here, and that we need to be able to hold both of those things, but really put our energies, keep renewing our energies into the latter, the valuable part, make that come alive in ourselves and help transmit it to others.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.